Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel where we create photorealistic assets together. So for today's video, I have a very relaxed one for you. I'm going to try to experiment and concept some sort of organic structure on this female face, and I'm going to show you the entire process. After I finish with my female bust, I just really feel like doing something that's a little bit more artistic, a little bit less technical problems. And I'm always really into this idea of building some sort of organic structure on a female face. So today I'm just gonna experiment some things in Zbrush and show you the entire process, and it's a little bit like an art practice. Today's video has nothing to do with what program I'm using. You should be able to experiment the same type of things in any sort of sculpting program that you feel comfortable with. All the techniques and brushes I'm using is very standard and basic. Another thing I want to mention is that I am a texture artist by training. I only sculpt for myself, so take everything I say with a huge grain of salt. I'm going to reuse the female face I just finished. It already has all the details. It will be a good starting point. I got some inspiration from The Last of Us sculpts, but at the same time, I really don't want to do anything that's super grotesque. I want to have a similar kind of shape and structure, but I still want her to look pretty. So that's the goal. It's a prettier, less grotesque The Last of Us, sort of. I think my goal of this practice is mostly just to experiment with shapes and really just focus on structures and silhouette, and try to get my eyes a little bit better in terms of be able to tell what kind of structure or silhouette that looks good. As you can see, before I started anything, I kind of paint over on the face a little bit. Just light scribbles, which I think everybody should be able to do, and just have a general idea of the general silhouette and what it will look like. Technically, the most thing I use here is just to mask out area on the face and using extract to get that piece of geometry out, and that's how I'm building new geometries on the face. I'm going to be using this method over and over again, and I think that's pretty much the most technical thing in this entire video. The brush I'm using mostly is the Move brush, standard brush, inflate, and the snake hook. The first few pieces I'm building is on her cheek. It's a bit of a bold structure to have there, but we're just experimenting today, so there is no right and wrong. I just want to test things out and see how everything looks. By the way, this entire face took me about 3 full days. Just want to mention that because I'm showing you a sped up video. Looking at some of the Last of Us concept art, I really like this idea that there's some sort of flower shape growing out of the top of the head. So that's the next thing I want to put on her. Same deal, I mask the area out and extract it. That's how I got this shape, and then mostly just use Move brush to move it into place. And also when I'm using Move brush, I'm also considering how big I want this thing to be. I think one important thing to do while you are sculpting, like concepting like this, is to, whatever adjustment you do on the piece you're working on, definitely make sure you are turning it constantly. Just because it looks good from the front view doesn't mean too much. You have to turn it to, let's say, 3/4, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, or maybe even slightly to the back to make sure the proportion and silhouette still looks good. And also at this moment, I'm mostly just blocking out shape. This thing needs to have actual details and structure later, but right now I'm just looking at how the size and the position and the general shape. So after repeating the same action a few times, this is what I have so far. Sorry for the skipped, but I do have 3 days worth of recording. It's impossible to put into one YouTube video. After I have all the pieces together, I still adjust their shape a little bit more. This one is more based on the relationship with each other. The general silhouette looks a little bit odd to me. The 3 of them kind of look equally distanced. It's not supernatural, but it's good for now because we have other areas to worry about. I bring this image into Photoshop again and try to figure out which structure I should do next. And I start to block out the silhouette I have currently, and I feel like it will be a good balance to have something a little bit bigger on the shoulder on the other side and something slightly smaller on the opposite side. And I think I'm going to have, besides the flower structure, I want to have some kind of leaf structure, kind of like what I see on The Last of Us sculpt. So I'm kind of blocking out how many leaf I will need to have that kind of like a bigger shape on the shoulder. It's always good to block this out in Sketch. So much easier. So when you go into Zbrush, you have less tweaks to do. I'm going to use the same technique. Just gonna mask out an area where I blocked out in my sketch, and I'm going to extract that and pull the shape into place. Here I'm starting to use a little bit more snake hook. It's a pretty good brush for pulling extra structure out. After repeating the same motion, I have built a cluster, and I started to adjust the shape to make the cluster look a little bit more natural. At this point, I'm mostly worried about the relationship between those three pieces, and also in general, the silhouette altogether. Is it matching what I was doing in Sketch? It's looking pretty good. It's good enough for now. I'm going to add the same thing on the other side. And I'm gonna go add something that breaks up the silhouette a little bit more. So far, every pieces we add around the neck area is more of a horizontal structure, and we do have some vertical structure on the top of the head, so I feel like it would be a good idea to add some vertical structure down here as well to make everything a little bit more consistent and break up that horizontal silhouette at the bottom. And I see this kind of like grass-shaped mushroom thing growing on the Last of Us concept, so I'm gonna try to add something like that here. Definitely making sure that it's never fully straight. One thing I forgot to mention is that every time I pull out the shape, I need to dynamesh the object. Otherwise, there is not going to be enough geometry for us to change the shape with. Now we have some big horizontal shape, we have some big vertical shape. I want to add a smaller shapes to her face just to break up the general proportion a little bit more. Well, not proportion, but design of her face. I thought it would be interesting to add smaller clusters of circular shape. You can consider them as small mushrooms, maybe. You see these kind of things growing in nature quite a bit. I feel like it would be interesting to add some cluster on the top of the head and on the opposite side of the neck. It could be a good detail to break up that long continuous shape we have so far. Now I think the general proportion is working. All the elements are making sense so far. It's time to figure out exactly what the flower shape looks like. Right now it's just a bit of a long blob and it's pretty ugly. I want them to kind of look like flowers, so they will have petals, but I need to decide where the petals are. And also, I don't want every flower to be just 3 petals. That will seem very repetitive. I have a few references lying around. I collect a whole bunch of different mushrooms in the wild. And by the way, mushrooms are really one of the most interesting thing to look at. I seriously fell into a rabbit hole of 2 hours just staring at different mushrooms on the internet. They are super interesting. In the future, I'm going to use them a lot more for my reference. As many references as I collected, here I'm not exactly following one specific reference. I'm using them more as inspiration, but mostly I'm playing with shapes. That's the key word for this entire video here, is to have fun and play with shapes. I'm mostly using a clay brush here, shaving off little bits and pieces from the shape until it looks interesting instead of very blobby. As I'm sculpting this shape, you can see how much I'm turning it around. I want to make sure the shape makes sense and it's pleasing to look at from every angle. When I'm sculpting like this, I don't know what the structure is. It's more just trying out different brush and try to feel the form and figure out the structure as I go. And sometimes definitely give room for happy accidents. I think one brush that's really good to use when you're just trying to figure out a structure is the standard brush. I think the brush really helps when you try to figure out which direction your form is facing. Just by turning the object slightly around and using the standard brush while you're turning the shape kind of gives you a very interesting idea of a more dynamic structure. For example, here I'm using a standard brush to try to define the shape of this long blob. But as I'm going down the structure, I'm also turning it at the same time. So the shape of this long thing start to facing different directions and start to look a little bit more dynamic. I kind of like how this area is turning out. It seems like the form is constantly turning all the way down and the form is never straight. There's always an interesting curvy structure going on. I think I will duplicate this into the other pieces as well. I find there's a really good trick of using standard brush while I'm using Z add to add shape to a form. I also constantly using Z sub to help define the shape I just created as well. Like I mentioned before, I want this thing to have some kind of flower petals, and that's what the two kind of pushed in structures are. I'm going to save the third area, this area, to be something that's actually been pushed out as a nice contrast and add some sort of weird spotty details on it. I hope you can tell I'm really having fun with sculpting like this, where I'm not trying to match anything exactly. It's just more of a practice of forms. Matching something to a realistic level is challenging and fun, but sometimes you just don't want to worry about those restrictions too much and just have some fun with your sculpt. A general rule of thumb when I sculpt is to worry about always the bigger form first before I ever add anything more specific and more detailed. The smaller detail only enhance the object if the bigger form is being taken care of. I think that's one of the most common mistakes when I see new sculptors make is spending way too much time trying to add those fine detail and think that that's going to impress people when the general form is wrong. And a lot of times the sculpt does not have a secondary structure. So for me, I mostly categorize the details into 3 levels. The first level is the general structure, is the general anatomy of whatever you're sculpting and the proportion, the silhouette. And then you need secondary form. It's the bigger breakup of the surface. And after that, you can worry about finer details like the little structure I'm doing inside of the flower petal right now. I will consider that to be fine detail. I'm going to stop the video here. It's too long of a video to show you the entire sculpting process. I think I already mentioned everything I used, technique, brushes, and thinking process to create something like this. I am considering starting a Patreon to put all the extra footage that I have for every video. It will be a place to put all the footage that's too long for YouTube, but not long enough to actually make a course out of. Maybe I will even add a mentoring tier if anybody is interested. Let me know what you think of this idea. That is everything I have for you today, and I will talk to you later.